Welcome to today's deep dive, fellow curious mind. I'm so glad you're here because what if I told you that the ultimate, definitive rule book for political villains wasn't actually written by some untouchable evil mastermind?
Right. It really wasn't.
No, not at all. What if the guy who practically invented our modern concept of ruthlessness was, at the time he actually wrote it, just a broke, unemployed, completely disgraced former bureaucrat? A
Uh,
guy who, spent his afternoons screaming at local bakers over pennies.
It kind of shatters the whole illusion, doesn't it? I mean, when you hear the word Machiavellian, you immediately conjure up this very specific imagery.
Totally.
You picture a guy sitting in a dimly lit room, maybe stroking a cat, right? Moving people around like pawns on a chessboard.
Yeah.
It implies this cold, calculated mastery of the
But
universe.
then you actually sit down to read the book that started it all, The Prince by Niccolò Machiavelli. And if you go into it expecting a step-by-step grimoire for becoming a supervillain, you are going to be incredibly confused.
Yeah, you really are.
In fact, we are looking at James B. Atkinson's extensively annotated translation of the book today, and he points this out right from the jump. Atkinson argues that readers who dive into The Prince without understanding the highly specific, incredibly messy history behind it, they frequently finish the book, put it down, and wonder what all the shouting was about.
Because without that context, you mean it reads less like a manual for evil and more like a very specific, honestly somewhat dry memo about 16th century Italian geopolitics. You're suddenly
Yeah.
reading about whether or not to put fortresses in conquered territories, and you just lose the thread of why this is supposed to be so diabolical.
Which brings us to our mission for today's deep dive. If you're listening to this, you probably already know that Machiavelli has a terrible reputation. We don't really need to rehash that. What we are going to do is reconstruct the gritty, chaotic, and frankly fascinating life of the real man.
Yes, the real man is so much more interesting.
Because to understand exactly why he wrote this masterpiece and how the mechanics of power actually forced his hand, you really have to step out of the myth and into the mud of Renaissance Florence. So, bringing in our expert here, okay, let's unpack this. Where do we even start?
Well, to truly grasp the prince, we have to look at the exact opposite of an ivory tower. This book was the product of a very specific time, a very specific place, and most importantly, a catastrophic personal failure.
Right.
To understand his incredibly cynical view of power, you first have to strip away the idea that he was some, aristocratic brat born with the silver spoon.
Yeah, let's start with his childhood, because I was genuinely surprised by this. He was born in Florence in 1469, and his father, Bernardo, was a humanist lawyer. Now, to my modern ears, humanist lawyer sounds like a guy pulling down a massive retainer living in a penthouse.
Right. It does sound prestigious. I mean, a humanist lawyer essentially meant he studied classical literature and law, so on paper, it's a very respectable title.
But not in reality.
No, in reality, if you didn't have the right clients or the right political connections in Florence, you were practically invisible. And Bernardo was struggling.
Wow.
Yeah, we actually have Bernardo's diary, his Libro di Ricordi, and it is just full of detailed, anxious entries about their financial instability. They were land rich but cash poor, basically constantly worried about the next tax bill.
Which obviously leaves a mark on a kid. Machiavelli himself later wrote this line that it stops you in your tracks. He said, "I was born poor and learned how to be poor before I learned how to be happy."
It's such a heavy burden to carry into adulthood, and he is carrying that weight into a remarkably turbulent era. When Machiavelli is 25, the incredibly powerful Medici family, who had basically run the Republic of Florence like their own personal piggy bank for years, are
Yeah.
suddenly expelled from the city.
And nature abhors a vacuum, right?
Exactly. Into that void steps a fundamentalist Dominican friar named Girolamo Savonarola. He essentially takes over, preaching that the recent French invasion of Italy is God's literal punishment for Florentine corruption.
And I imagine a pragmatic guy like Machiavelli who, learned how to count pennies before he learned how to be happy is probably looking at a religious firebrand with a lot of skepticism.
Oh, deep skepticism. Machiavelli listened to Savonarola preach, but he didn't buy into the prophetic fire and brimstone hype for a second.
He saw right through it.
He really did. He was already looking past the moral dressing to see the mechanics of power underneath. He even noted that Savonarola was a man who proceeds by favoring circumstances and whitewashing his lies.
Meaning he's just a politician wearing a robe.
Precisely. And eventually, the political winds shift, Savonarola falls out of favor, and the city literally burns him at the stake.
Brutal.
Very. And almost immediately after that, in 1498, the newly reorganized Florentine Republic needs a civil servant. So they hire our young, skeptical Machiavelli as the second chancellor.
I think we need to define what a second chancellor actually is, because it's really easy to picture him as a prime minister or a king making grand decrees. But really, his role was much closer to a mid-level bureaucratic fixer or like a chief of staff, wasn't it?
That is a great way to put it. He wasn't the guy crafting the overarching grand strategy of the Republic. He was the guy in the room where it happened, tasked with the massive headache of actually implementing the decisions.
Right.
When a geopolitical fire broke out, he was the one riding out on horseback on these grueling diplomatic missions to go negotiate with foreign powers.
And think about who those foreign powers were.
Yeah.
What's fascinating here is how this specific role shaped his entire worldview. He wasn't sitting in a university debating theories of how people should behave.
No, not at all.
He was constantly exposed to how people actually behaved. He's dealing directly with the most cutthroat figures of the Renaissance people, like Pope Alexander VI and his infamous son, Caesar Borgia.
Right. And dealing with Caesar Borgia, I mean, that changes a person. Machiavelli got a front row seat to the raw, unvarnished exercise of power.
He saw the reality of it.
Yeah, he saw firsthand that morality and political success were completely divorced from one another. If you want to survive, you deal with reality as it is, not as you wish it to be.
He's seeing the sausage get made every single day. And as the ultimate fixer for Florence, his bosses eventually hand him the biggest, ugliest problem the Republic has, which is their military weakness.
Yes, this is a huge issue for them.
Because Florence was an incredibly wealthy city of merchants and bankers, but they didn't have their own standing army. They relied entirely on mercenaries, which forces Machiavelli to transition from a desk jockey to an actual military organizer.
And we have to explain why mercenaries were the norm, because it sets up the disaster perfectly.
Yeah, please do.
Well, if you're a rich merchant republic, it seems easier to just write a check and hire professionals to fight your wars. But there is a massive flaw in that logic, and Florence found out the hard way in the year 1500.
The disaster at Pisa.
Exactly.
Put yourself in Machiavelli's shoes for a second, right?
Yeah.
Florence is trying to recapture the neighboring city of Pisa. Through an alliance with the French king, you manage to hire a contingent of Swiss and Gascon mercenaries. These guys are supposed to be the most ferocious, terrifying, professional soldiers that money can buy.
The absolute elite.
Right.
So Florence pays them a fortune. These highly paid mercenaries march up to the walls of Pisa, they set up their cannons, they bombard the city, and then they just refuse to enter and take it.
Wait, they just refuse?
Yeah. They mutiny against their own leaders, pack up their camps, and basically just shrug and go home to Milan.
Which, okay, if you think about the mechanics of being a mercenary, makes perfect, cold, logical sense. I mean, your capital is your body. If you die breaching a wall, you can't spend your gold. So why risk it if things look a little too dangerous?
It makes sense for the mercenaries, sure, but it is an absolute nightmare if you're the bureaucrat trying to defend a republic. The Florentines are furious, and Machiavelli is the one who has to clean up the diplomatic and financial mess.
That must have been awful.
It was, and this event solidifies his absolute hatred of relying on paid foreign fighters. They just have no loyalty to your city.
So what does a pragmatic fixer do? He decides Florence needs its own citizen army, which is a radical idea at the time. He works tirelessly to convince Florence's head of state, the Gonfalonier Piero Soderini, to let him draft a militia.
Right.
And finally, in 1506, he gets the green light. But I want to pause here, because the way he goes about drafting this army is so telling. If you're listening to this and wondering why he didn't just draft his own neighbors from the streets of Florence, there's a very specific reason.
Right. He intentionally avoids the city dwellers. Why? Because city dwellers in Renaissance Florence had intense, deeply entrenched factional loyalties. They hated each other almost as much as they hated their enemies.
Wow.
Yeah, if you hand a bunch of rival Florentine merchants thousands of pikes and swords, they might just overthrow your government instead of defending the walls.
Yeah. So Machiavelli personally rides out into the rural countryside areas like Mugello and Casentino. He conscripts peasants over the age of 15. He recruits them, organizes them, and begins to train them himself. Wait, I really want this image to land. The guy we think of as this sinister philosopher of evil was actually out in the mud in the rural countryside, teaching literal farmers which end of a lance is pointy.
That is exactly what he was doing. He was out there in the elements, and they were quite a sight. We actually have a vivid description from a primary source, a local Florentine pharmacist named Luca Landucci, who kept a diary.
Oh, I love this part.
It's great. He describes a parade of 400 of Machiavelli's new peasant recruits marching through the piazza. They were outfitted in white waistcoats, shoes, iron breastplates, and a very distinct pair of stockings that were half red and half white.
It sounds like an underdog sports team. You've got the local heart, you've got these flashy, colorful new uniforms, the pharmacist is cheering for them. But let's be real. At the end of the day, you're replacing seasoned, battle-hardened professionals with enthusiastic amateurs. You're basically sending farmers to do a soldier's job.
And my modern brain wants the underdog spirit to win out. Right, we've seen that move.
Like that, eh?
But historically speaking, when amateurs meet professionals, the outcome is usually brutal. And that sports analogy perfectly sets up the tragic turning point of Machiavelli's life. Because eventually that amateur team in the red and white stockings is going to have to play in the big leagues.
Let's talk about the big game. The year is 1512. Pope Julius II has decided he wants to crush the Republic of Florence and put the Medici family back in charge. And the Pope isn't sending a strongly worded letter. He is sending a battle-hardened Spanish army.
Professional killers.
Exactly. These are professional killers. They march into Tuscany and attack the town of Prato, which is just 12 miles away from Florence. And defending Prato is Machiavelli's proud, newly minted citizen militia.
And when these rural conscripts face the terrifying reality of professional Spanish veterans charging at them, they completely crack.
I mean, who wouldn't?
Right. The psychological terror is just too much. They drop their weapons and flee in absolute cowardice. The Spanish sack Prato brutally. And because of this humiliating, instant military collapse, the Florentine Republic folds like a house of cards.
It's just over.
Yeah. The leader, Soderini, flees for his life, and the Medici family, the old oligarchs, march right back into power.
And since Machiavelli was the chief fixer for the regime that just collapsed, he's standing right at ground zero.
He is obliterated. Early in November 1512, he is fired from his job. He is fined a staggering 1,000 gold florins.
Oh, man.
Right. For a man who grew up counting pennies, that is an astronomical, bankrupting sum. He is banned from entering the government palace. And it gets unimaginably worse.
How could it get worse?
Well, a few months later, his name is discovered on a piece of paper belonging to a group of anti-Medici conspirators, the Boscoli conspiracy.
Let me push back on that for a second. Was he actually foolish enough to be plotting to overthrow the new Medici government right after they took over?
Most historians think it's highly unlikely. He was desperately trying to get the Medici to hire him at this point. He just wanted his job back.
That makes sense.
But it didn't matter. Guilt by association was enough. He was thrown into prison and tortured. He endured the strappado, which is an excruciating process where your hands are tied behind your back, you are repeatedly hoisted up into the air by a rope, and then dropped, violently dislocating the shoulder.
It's just horrific. I can't even imagine.
It's awful. But he survived this,
Yeah.
maintained his innocence through the torture, and was only freed by a stroke of pure luck. A member of the Medici family happened to be elected Pope Leo X, and the family issued a general amnesty to celebrate. So they let Machiavelli out.
Okay, here's the thing I struggle to wrap my head around. A few years prior to this disaster, Machiavelli's close friend, Casavecchia, wrote him a letter praising his political genius, literally calling him the greatest prophet.
Yes, he did.
If Machiavelli was such a brilliant student of power, how did he not see this total ruin coming? How did the guy who wrote the book on anticipating your enemies miscalculate so badly?
It's a fantastic question. And the brutal truth is that all the theoretical knowledge in the world, all the clever diplomatic maneuvering, it can't always stop the raw momentum of history. He believed in his militia, but he underestimated the sheer terror of facing professional killers. He believed in his diplomatic alliances, but the geopolitical winds shifted too fast. Sometimes you can make the most logical move on the chessboard, and the other guy just flips the board over.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Because this spectacular, bone-crushing failure, it breaks him. He loses his dignity, his income, his physical health, but it also creates the exact conditions necessary for his enduring fame. Without this total collapse, the world never gets the prince.
Precisely. Stripped of his titles and his access to the halls of power, Machiavelli is banished from Florence. He is forced to retire to a small, dusty family estate in the countryside at San Andrea in Percasina.
Such a fall from grace.
Exactly. And the portrait we have of his life there is one of agonizing, mind-numbing boredom for a man who used to thrive on the adrenaline of high-stakes diplomacy.
I love how we know exactly what this looked like. We have this incredible primary source, a letter he wrote on December 10th, 1513, to his friend Francesco Vittori, who was still serving as an ambassador in Rome.
It's such a revealing letter.
It really is. Machiavelli details his humiliating daily routine. He wakes up before dawn to catch thrushes. And he's not doing this for sport. He's literally trapping birds with his bare hands using bird lime, which is a sticky sap you smear on branches to get the bird stuck.
Right.
Then he walks into his woods to yell at the woodcutters over minor disputes. Then he goes and sits by a spring with a book under his arm. Dante or Ovid reading love poetry and feeling intensely sorry for himself.
But the afternoons are where you really feel the sting of his exile. He spends them down at the local country inn. He writes that he eats a meager lunch, and then he plays cards, a game called cricket and backgammon.
And who's he playing with?
Exactly. Consider who he is playing with. The local butcher, the miller, and a couple of bakers. These men, who a year ago would have been completely beneath his notice, are now his entire social circle. And they spend the afternoons squabbling and screaming at each other over pennies. Machiavelli actually notes they can hear us yelling in San Casciano.
It's just so pathetic. The analogy that comes to mind is an ousted, hyper-competitive Wall Street CEO who's been forced into early retirement. To satisfy that desperate psychological need to compete, to feel some sort of pulse, he ends up playing cutthroat, high-stakes bingo at the local community center.
That's spot on.
He's treating a card game with a baker like it's a tense negotiation with the King of France, just to feel alive.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you can feel the absolute desperation radiating off the page. He writes to his friend that he does this to soothe the malice of his fate, essentially picking fights over pennies, just waiting to see if fortune will eventually be ashamed of treating him so terribly.
Right.
But then the letter takes a dramatic turn. Evening comes.
The climax of his day. And this is the moment history pivots.
He leaves the inn and walks back to his modest house. He goes into his study. And before he sits down, he has this incredibly poignant ritual. He physically strips off his everyday clothes, the garments covered in mud, dirt, bird sap, and as he puts it, lice. Yeah, and he carefully puts on what he calls courtly garments. Even in this empty house in the countryside, he dresses as if he is about to step back into the diplomatic courts of Europe. And in that quiet room, he opens his history books and communes with the great men of antiquity.
He steps out of the mud and back into his mind. By putting on those clothes, he's telling himself, I am not a peasant, I am a statesman.
Exactly. It's a psychological coping mechanism. He writes that he asks the ancients the reasons for their actions, and they answer him. For 4 hours, he says, he feels no boredom, forgets every worry, doesn't fear poverty, and isn't terrified by death.
That is just beautiful.
It is. And it is in this exact space, fueled by the grief of losing his career, the humiliation of his poverty, and his desperate desire to prove to the Medici family that he still has value so they might give him a job, that he distills his 14 years of diplomatic experience into a little manual, a book he calls The Prince.
So what does this all mean? When we zoom out and look at this journey, from the poor lawyer's son to the high-flying bureaucratic fixer, to the disgraced, tortured guy arguing over pennies with a baker, it completely reframes his legacy.
It really does.
The next time you hear someone use the word Machiavellian to describe a cold, calculating winner moving pawns on a board, remember this context. The Prince is not a confident manual for evil. It is a desperate, pleading job application from a highly experienced, deeply broken man who mixes the game of politics so intensely that he is, in his own words, scraping the mold off his brain just to survive the countryside.
It's a profound shift in perspective. He wasn't sitting in a dark room petting a cat. He was sitting in a dark room trying to write his way out of hell.
Wow.
And this raises a final important question, something really fascinating for you to ponder long after we wrap up here. Let's imagine that alternate history for a second. What if Machiavelli's citizen army, those farmers in the red and white stockings, had actually held their ground and won the battle against the Spanish at Prato?
The Republic survives.
The Republic survives. Machiavelli keeps his job. He remains a successful, moderately comfortable, but ultimately entirely forgotten civil servant. There is no exile, there is no mud, there are no courtly garments in the evening study.
So he never writes the book.
He never writes the book, which leaves us wondering, does true, enduring, world-changing brilliance sometimes require a catastrophic personal failure to be unleashed?
Wow. From the guy covered in bird sap to the man who shaped a modern political thought, it makes you realize that the real story behind the cartoon villain is always so much more human and so much messier than the myth. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.